Okay, we are rolling.
Thanks, Brian. Welcome, friends, to our event, War, Peace, and the Supreme Court with Samuel Moyn. This event is sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action. If this is your first time at Mass Peace Action, welcome. Massachusetts Peace Action is a grassroots group focused on building a more peaceful and just society. Some of our priorities include ending US forever wars, cutting the $750 billion Pentagon budget, ending the war in Yemen, preventing war with Iran, ending our deadly sanctions on Iran and Venezuela and other countries, and much more. We are joined tonight by Samuel Moyn. Samuel is a professor of history at Yale University, and he is the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School. Professor Moyn is a fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's written multiple books. His most recent is called Not Enough: Human Rights in an Unequal World. And he's edited or co-edited multiple other books. Professor Moyn received a doctorate in European history from University of California, Berkeley, and a law degree from Harvard University. We are very grateful and excited to have Professor Moyn with us tonight. Professor Moyn, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a thrill to be here.
So, Professor Moyn, there's a lot to discuss tonight. To get started, let's talk a little about a piece you co-wrote called The Infinity War. I really enjoyed this piece. You lay out some of the historical context for US military interventions, and you also write a little bit about legal constraints on war, including international law and domestic law. I'd like to cover all of that, but to get us started, at one point in the piece you wrote, quote, "Ultimately, elevating peace as a priority will require not merely changing legal norms, but overturning the militarized concept of America's world role that permeates Washington." Can you speak a little bit more about that? How did this, quote, militarized concept of America's role in the world come to be? Also, can you relate this a little to the incoming Biden administration?
Sure. So first, I know that many on this Zoom call have been working on peace activism for a long time, and I'm just an observer and scholar, and would love to learn from all of you. I wrote the piece in the Washington Post with Stephen Wertheim, who is one of the intellectual leaders of the new Quincy Institute, which you mentioned. And the point of that is to kind of provide a beltway thinking that has been sorely lacking in recent decades, since sadly it seems like both mainstream Democrats and Republicans have been pretty militaristic. And shockingly, that's increased since the end of the Cold War, when you might have thought that America would capitalize on its status as the sole superpower to make good on, its original promises at the end of World War II to bring a Pax Americana. Now, Stephen is a former student, among other things, and he's gone off to run a Washington think tank, but he just came out with the revised version of his dissertation, which is called Tomorrow the World, and I recommend it because it contains one of the big answers to your question. It's a study of how it and when it was that Americans made a choice to rule the world through military primacy. Now, he focuses on a brief period after the fall of France in 1940. And, he shows that the United Nations was really devised by Americans as a kind of smokescreen for its own kind of carte blanche military authority to go where, makes sense, at least to those in Washington. I think there are a lot of, subsequent events. You can't forget that, the significance of the loss, so-called, of China in the late 1940s and the Korean War just starting the next year, because that's when on the back of the creation of the national security establishment, the Defense Department and so forth, you really get the extraordinary military budgetary outlays that have been a fixture of American life ever since. And it's just shocking when you look at the continuity of bipartisan commitment to these, with maybe a brief period in the later stages of the Vietnam War, when a sliver of the Democratic Party tried to buck the tide. But, just to illustrate, we're under the impression that the two parties are more polarized now, reflecting more polarization in the country than at any point. This is often said. And that came to a head in the impeachment and trial of Donald John Trump, which we know was a straight party line vote with one exception. You know who that is. And yet, during that impeachment trial, both parties came together for this annual ritual that they have, which is the approval of the National Defense Authorization Act. And what both sides agree about, including, Trump's bitterest enemy, like Adam Schiff, California representative, is that, the military, it has to be given the bulk of the nation's discretionary spending. And of course it reached its peak under Trump. So what are the reasons for this? That's such a, tough question. We could tell a story about origins. That's what Wertheim does in his book, or we could get into, East Asian affairs if we want, with the fall of China and Korea. But I think what happened is you get these self-perpetuating forces, that Dwight Eisenhower famously in his farewell address called the military-industrial complex, and really like a whole culture. So there's a continuity of real interests, you might say, through the present. And then you have ideology. And that's where I focus, because I am interested in what people believe, to rationalize to themselves and justify to others what they do. And so there we have to look at how the Democrats around George McGovern lost out. And instead, you get two groups that are actually very close to each other ideologically, who came to rule the two parties in foreign policy, the neocons on the right and the liberal internationalists on the left. Now, ironically, these were the other two factions of the Democratic Party in the 1970s, because remember, the neocons were Democrats first. And the liberal internationalists, those who beat back against the McGovernites, but stayed in the Democratic Party, people like Richard Holbrooke, won. And so what we have are two parties that, have their beltway think tanks and so forth, and they all essentially agree about almost everything. And so there's aside from real interest, there's the politics of expertise. These folks think they know what they're talking about and say they do. So, when I look at it, you start to get very troubled about Joe Biden and his picks, because we have people in power now who come from those traditions. They've worked for the military-industrial complex. People like Antony Blinken and Michelle Flournoy, who will probably become the defense secretary, were out of power, were Democrats out of power under Trump and set up, their own consulting firm for companies like Raytheon. But more important, ideologically, they believe that America has a mission, and it's to be the indispensable nation for, freedom and morality. The trouble is that they've been proven to be very bad stewards of both freedom and morality. And America has proven to be a disastrous agent for those things. So we have folks now back in power, thanks to Biden and the Democrats, who have been delegitimated more than ever. I think that's our opportunity, the opportunity for a group like this to keep the pressure on and say, you brought us, support for the neocon Iraq war. You brought us the destruction under Barack Obama of Libya. In this region, the neocons destroyed one country, Iraq, and the liberal internationalists destroyed another, Libya. And let's not even talk about Syria. So I think we have some signs of hope. Thanks to the hashtag End Endless War, Joe Biden, wrote a foreign affairs piece, or Tony Blinken did for him, that says, I believe in ending endless war. And though he himself supported the Iraq war, it's only fair to note that he was a voice of restraint in the Obama administration, Joe Biden, like he opposed the Libyan intervention. Then you have the younger kids, like Yale law graduate Jake Sullivan, who said in 2017, after helping guide Hillary Clinton's campaign and losing, that he had the humility of the defeated, and said, I have to learn from my mistakes. But, the question is, does someone like that mean it? And anyway, what were the mistakes? So we have to watch very carefully to see if the rhetoric of lessons learned and restraints taken more seriously than before are actually adopted in practice. And I'd say, it's too soon to tell.
Wow, that's great. So, it's interesting you talk about, I think you said Tony Blinken said something about he now supports ending endless war, but I've also been seeing a lot of his quotes talking about things related to America as a leader in the world and I guess a superpower. And if America isn't exercising its leadership, it creates a power vacuum. Sounds to me like liberal intervention kind of rhetoric. So and the stuff you talk about this culture of the military-industrial complex in the Democratic and Republican administrations, we also encounter it in Congress. Like a lot of our Democratic members of Congress who we lobby, they have that same sort of ideology. So I guess the question for you is, you mentioned something about there's hope for groups like ours to put pressure on the Biden administration, or I guess even Congress, for more peaceful policies. But how exactly would we do that? Should we keep talking to our Massachusetts members of Congress and telling them, hey, we're against war in Iran, we want to cut the military budget? Are there more effective ways to push these issues?
I'm not a strategist or a tactician, and you all know a lot more about movement building than I do. I mean, I guess I would say that all of the above. It's really important to keep pressure on the legislators, but in the end, I think we have to await cultural change, and that requires the really hard work of engaging our fellow citizens and building coalitions that are broader than the ones we've had. So just to, give some, further thought to this, first off, the 2020 election revealed that there are a lot of people who vote for Donald Trump, and there's just really nothing to do about that except to own it and figure out what it would take to change their thinking. I do think part of the issue in 2016 was that the Democrats allowed Trump, who had run as an anti-war candidate of a kind against Republicans, to beat Hillary Clinton, in part because she had voted for the Iraq War and brushed it off, where Trump at least claimed to take seriously its lessons and lied about having supported it himself. And of course, won the support of lots and lots of veterans down to the end. But if you think about our Democratic representatives, assuming we have to stick to the bipartisan system, I think that there's still a view, even if they begin to understand that America is not the same country as it was in 1945, that we're in a moment of geopolitical change. They fear that any hint of commitment to peace will be radioactive electorally. There's a famous tagline from James Mann, who is a great chronicler of Washington, foreign policy thinking. And he wrote a book about Barack Obama's foreign policy. And he remarks that Obama had to deal with the legacy of the two Georges. One, of course, was George W. Bush, his immediate predecessor. But the one he really had to reckon with was George McGovern, because once McGovern lost so badly, it almost became a part of the Democrats' institutional credo that they could not be seen as soft on defense. And they had to be, at the head of the line in supporting the American military and American wars. And so only once that perception is changed, only once we can convince more politicians, which we are, the AOCs and the Cori Bushes and so forth, that you can win while diverging from the ironclad status quo militarism of both American political parties, can we see real change. So I think the work has to be in the trenches of our communities, and engaging citizens who, it turns out, just have very different values. I mean, it's still amazing to me that liberals spent 4 years treating Donald Trump as beyond the pale, only to see him gain more votes than he did the first time, including votes of a more diverse electorate in spite of his misogyny and racism. So that tells us that the liberals have a credibility problem themselves, and our role has to be to change them, to make them more appealing to a broader group of Americans than they have been in the last 2 national elections.
Yeah, sure. I agree completely. And I am very hopeful about the electoral victories of AOC, Ilhan Omar, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman. I have hope, but there's some who are cynical about it, and I worry about that as well, that the military-industrial complex is too powerful, and it will end up essentially getting these new progressive lawmakers to support their agenda. What are your thoughts on that?
It hasn't happened yet, and these are classic outsiders who are taking a run at the institutions of their party, and they understand that they're on the losing end right now with the appointment of not just Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, but Neera Tanden, another Yale law graduate. There's some hope in other places on the economic side. It's really the foreign policy side where the left should be most appalled by the apparent continuity in personnel, which how can it not suggest continuity in policy? And yet I have high hopes for your generation, young people who are compared to my generation, who were young in the 1990s, really have given up the illusions of the end of history. And I believe that's true of some of these new voices in Congress. So I don't think that they're likely to be turncoats. I think the bigger issue is the party and its institutions, like the DNC, because that determines whether the small coalition of the Squad and others can be broadened. The election of Cori Bush, where I'm from in St. Louis, is a huge victory, not least because it adds to the Midwestern left, which was an old tradition with Ilhan Omar and others. Now it's urban. And so I think, we have to somehow revive the anti-war credentials of the America's agrarian, traditions. We've just done very poorly in reactivating those. But that's where it all came from the first time around. And McGovern was just the last, vestige of that old tradition, which, we have to reawaken. And that means a different kind of activism alongside, the kind that's winning things for the Squad in some cities.
Sure. Okay, let's get into a little bit. In the Infinity War, you describe various legal constraints on war, including international law and domestic law. So let's talk a little bit about U.S. relationship with international law, starting with the formation of the UN, and could you tie it into Bill Clinton's activities in Kosovo and then the 2003 invasion of Iraq?
Yeah, so, just as a prefatory matter, let me just say, the law is just a tool and it's just something to get people to believe. Same with, morality. We disagree about, whether it exists, what it says, but the fact is that with law, at least we can indict our political leaders for betraying rules we at least can claim that apply to them, and see if we can gain traction for our values that way. And so, I'm not, we can talk about law. We shouldn't have a naive legalism, because in the end, the law means nothing unless it's accepted. And that requires it to be backed by enough people to bring pressure to bear on the powerful, always, in all domains. So, there are two, big sets of laws. One is in the Constitution, and we're just so far from what the framers imagined, which involved the assignment of war powers to the Congress, that, some effort to put things right seems, crucial in our time. There was an attempt to put things right at the end of Vietnam with the War Powers Resolution, but it's been gutted, including by Democrats like Obama. Then there's international law. The United States set up the United Nations, and at least in theory, it set it up as precisely a peace organization. Of course, in the way that the Security Council was devised, the United States made it impossible for it ever to be branded an aggressor in world affairs. But there are still rules coming out of the UN Charter regarding the use of force. And, you know, we can cite those. We can remind Americans that the Nuremberg trials were not principally about Nazi atrocities. It was about holding the German leaders accountable for breaching the peace. And indeed, you know, the American prosecutor, a Supreme Court justice named Robert Jackson, said, we're consecrating rules that have to apply to ourselves too. We can't pass the Germans a poison chalice, he said, and go on to breach the peace ourselves just because we can get away with it. And so, you know, my thought is that we appeal to these rules. Now, how has that fared lately? Well, not well, because you have a system in which America interprets international law to its liking. And there's not a level of literacy about it that there's enough pushback. Now, that's partly false, because you'll all remember how much we talked about the Geneva Conventions after March 2004 when the Abu Ghraib photos leaked. And we got torture out of the war on terror, but we didn't talk enough or didn't succeed in getting people to take seriously enough the other rules about whether and when you can go to war and how long it can last. And it was under Obama that, you know, this clean, torture-free war went all kinds of new places. And in spite of Obama's own urgings, didn't come close to ending. Rather, it took on a new form with, you know, lots of new drone usage and massive reliance on special forces. And, you know, the interpretations of both domestic and international law that Obama sponsored and Trump continued are just incredible. And they aren't about torture or civilian casualties. They're about when the United States can use its force abroad at all. So let me just give two examples. And if people are interested, we can pursue it. You know, the first is the legislative authorization in 2001 to conduct the war on terror against Al-Qaeda and so-called associated forces. You know, one person voted against it, California Representative Barbara Lee. And that was a day on which she warned that this would become a warrant for endless war. And she was totally right. Because even once Al-Qaeda was gone and you had copycat groups, Obama decided he didn't have to go back to Congress for a new authorization. It was really like a replay of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which authorized the Vietnam War in all of its elements down to the end. And, you know, whether, you know, there's so many examples. In international law, there are rules about when you can use force on the territory of an unconsenting state because it has terrorists that are working on that territory. And America revised those radically so that it could use force, in particular in Syria. And this was a revision that American lawyers in the Obama White House proposed, and even our own allies rejected them, not to mention most international lawyers around the world. And it just didn't matter. So, you know, my sense is that we work with what we have. These are weak tools to appeal to the Constitution and the UN Charter that have been really left by the side of the road by the last three presidents. But what else do we have? You know, we have morality always, and that's the most powerful tool, except that it's not that powerful either. So my sense is that these legal arguments ought to be in the mix of things we bring to bear when we're making our case for more restraint.
Sure, and no, I'm glad you touched on the points you made about the legal system. It touches upon my next question. I mean, let me just read from your piece for a second. It says, you and your co-author wrote, by the time Obama intervened in Libya, the war powers resolution lay in tatters. In a final indignity during the Libya operation, one administration lawyer explained that hostilities was an ambiguous term of art that might exclude aerial bombardment. So Congress did not need to approve a war that toppled a regime. So, and I mean, you kind of touched on this already, but I mean, I'm no legal expert or law student, but it seems to me like they're just doing whatever they want and then finding or creating legal justifications for it. So I guess the question is like, does the law even mean anything if they just do whatever they want anyways?
Well, so, you know, it's a great question. We can't be naive and think the law is ever clear. That's why, you know, we're in a system where lawyers can exact a lot of money from us to try to get a friendly reading. You know, the trouble is that in this domain, there's no court except the American people. And the president has all the lawyers. There's no other side. Congress doesn't have its own attorney general to say, no, the president's understanding of the law is wrong or debatable. You know, the courts could get involved in this, but they've crafted doctrines to stay out. Again, sadly, the only time the Supreme Court has gotten involved in the war on terror is precisely to call for it to be more humane in the areas of detention, especially like Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, 2005. And that fits in this scary picture, which my book in September is about, of how in certain ways, the stress on making war humane has baked in endless war. And the courts are a really good example of that because they never get involved in stopping war. They only got involved briefly in making it more humane. Now, the Libyan situation was pretty flagrant, though, because the War Powers Resolution at the end of Vietnam says that Congress has to sign off on hostilities after 60 days or they can't continue. But it was my own colleague, a very talented lawyer by the name of Harold Koh, who was advising, who worked for the administration in 2011. And he went in Congress and he said, but bombing doesn't count as hostilities. But, you know, where were our lawyers for the American people to say that's ridiculous? That's a betrayal of language. And so, you know, we need different institutions so that we can make our legal claims heard. And, you know, the sad thing is that these legal standards are pretty flexible and they really depend on how good your lawyers are. So, you know, that's why we need Congress to lawyer up better, and we need to pressure our Congress people to, you know, interrogate the claims that the executive branch is making, because the courts aren't going to do it. But again, the alternative to relying on these weak legal standards is relying on something that is, you know, maybe more weak in most situations, morality, more contested, although it's also more powerful, as you know, because once we get a moral consensus going as a movement and convince more fellow citizens, it trumps everything and changes politics. So, you know, I'm just suggesting that we not give up on law, because amongst the weak tools we have right now, it's one of the tools to see what we can do. But the record is bleak. Now, in fairness, I think a lot of people look back and say that given Trump's victory over the establishment, there's more reason to think the establishment has to be careful, is going to care a lot more about excess and mistake. And so I think that's a propitious circumstance for us to say, you will bring back Trump again with your militarism if you don't stop it. If not Trump, some other demagogue, which is what empires in decline tend to get in history. And so I think, law could be useful, but surely not as the only emphasis.
Do you see the US as an empire in decline? Is Trump a symptom of that?
Yeah, that would be my reading. I think he's, we talk about blowback. Chalmers Johnson and so many others have argued that American policy, it leads to the creation of new opposition. And to me, the Trump phenomenon is really a form of internal blowback to the wars abroad and the inequality at home. And it led a lot of Americans to say the elites don't govern for the sake of the majority. And so they engaged in a protest vote, first within the Republican Party, in the shocking victory of Trump over his mainstream Iraq war supporting Republican rivals in 2016. And then even more shockingly over Hillary Clinton, who, was a representative of the militarist neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party. So that's worth protesting. The trouble is that, Trump was the wrong, person to break those imperial policies. And so we're back in the same situation.
Sure. So, you described law, whether it's international or domestic, as weak tools to end war, essentially. So what would the strong tools be? I guess morality, but you kind of also said that's weak or strong. But so I guess is the main thing to do here is, have discussions like this with our friends and family, and do the grassroots work of exposing these ideas and winning the argument.
It seems like it. I think we have to there's very little that people like me can do, because, for scholars, we go back and say, look at all of these, more promising traditions, and look at how the Democratic Party went the way it did. And, after George McGovern in a neoliberal age. And, but the real, the real work is by all of you. And I just see that as the essence. I mean, we know that there are no strong tools, because if there were, we would have, deployed them. But there's a potentially strong tool, which is, the revolution whose time has come. And how does it come? Well, it's convincing numbers of people, and that can only happen, slowly. I note in the comments here, I guess Hugh says rightly that, the populations that were actually the least militarist, in part because they adopted a form of, Christianity associated with William Jennings Bryan and the rest, were in Midwestern agrarian circumstances. But Hugh rightly points out that they're lost to that cause. On the other hand, if we stick to Eastern Massachusetts and Eastern, coastal Connecticut, where I live, then we fail to win the rigged game that American democracy is, which assigns so much importance to what we call the red states. I'm very deeply, complicit in this, because I work in these universities where, people come from all over the country. They meet one another, marry, stay on the coast, and make a lot of money. That's like the essential function of these universities. And I work at one, and I teach these students. So, I mean, we're all soiled to a greater or lesser extent, and hopefully for a good cause. But, we can't just, abandon the spaces of the country that were once kind of provided the biggest pressure against, the pathologies of elite rule. And, as a Midwesterner, I think the Midwest is very important, but, there are lots of places, because, in Massachusetts or Connecticut, you can take a drive into Trump country very quickly. The divisions are within each place, not just within the country. And so it seems like we have local work to do and national work, or you do more exactly.
Sure. And I'm glad you mentioned that stuff about the red states. When I was interning in DC not too long ago, about a year ago, for a self-described progressive member of Congress, a lot of the staff members, like the senior staff members, they had this like palpable disdain for people from quote unquote red states, or people who are Trump voters, or even non-voters, I guess. And you could say that was the view of the establishment, but I also see it a lot here in Massachusetts with, just regular people, Democratic voters, where there's this strong, like, we want to write off all Trump voters because they're all racist, apparently. And, we spoke a little bit before the event about Matt Taibbi's book, Hate Inc., and the role the media might play in this division. So I guess the question for you is, for a place like Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts, how do we overcome the way we caricaturize people in red states or Trump voters or non-voters?
I think it's a great question. I was maybe most scandalized in 2016 when I was in I lived in Cambridge, Mass, taught at Harvard, and I went to one of those, cocktail parties, and I remember very vividly that one of my colleagues said, in response to Trump's victory, we should just, have the Eastern Seaboard secede and California secede. And, that's a deeply hurtful thing for a Missourian, because it means you're consigning a lot of people. That's like saying, let's let the South secede in 1860 and keep slavery. It's just as bad. Now, that's not to say we should accept the rigged system where, the Electoral College and the Senate and so forth allow a minority to rule instead of a majority. But it does mean, I think, that we try to exercise some empathy with those who are in protest against governing elites, because there's really no other way to interpret voting for Trump. There was always a lot of racism, and we're all implicated in structural racism, including most definitely in the Democratic Party. Who do you think set up mass incarceration, et cetera? So I think we have to figure out what policies we can convince a majority across different kinds of places in the country to support. Now, of course, that's very difficult. As you say, the media is toxic, but again, it's toxic on both sides. What should the Democrats have been doing after 2016 to try to save the country? Well, figuring out what policies would get Democrats a supermajority enough to break the stranglehold of the Senate and so forth. But instead, they blamed Russia, and they blamed, racism, and
Jill Stein.
They ended up proving that they can't win very big. So I would say a big strategic rethink is critical, and it would have to involve figuring out how we can reach common ground enough to talk to our political enemies.
Yeah. Let's pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and you had some interesting comments about why we should disempower the Supreme Court. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, most of us have grown up, gone to high school, you know, like I went to public high school and took civics, and were taught that the Supreme Court is good and necessary. In fact, that's not true. You know, most countries have not had one. Most countries have done fine. Even those that have had one have never given as much power to an institution like a higher judiciary as our system has over time. And it's again, once you realize that the law is just what people believe it is, it's a power to decide big policy outcomes for the American people in all these different domains. Now, we can talk about the way in which there have been progressive decisions in Supreme Court history, especially during Earl Warren's Chief Justiceship, but even more recently with respect to gay rights and same-sex marriage. But, you know, we get the court of the era that, you know, it's making its decisions in, and ours is this neoliberal era. So we have the most business-friendly court in a century, and it's converted protection of free speech into protection of corporations and the destruction of unions. And none of that's in the Constitution. It's all just their policy making. So the question is what we ought to do about it. So the traditional answer is hope that people die at the right time so that Democrats can appoint the justices. Well, first of all, that's ridiculous because it leaves to chance and makes like a game of roulette the direction of the country. And sadly, the Republicans keep winning because the justices die on their watch. You know, it's an amazing fact. Since 1969, the Republicans have appointed, I think, 13 justices to the Democrats' 4, which is an amazing thing, even though the presidency has been held equally by both parties. And that's purely down to when the justices died or chose to retire. So, you know, what happened with Mitch McConnell's hijinks, not just with Ruth Ginsburg, but back in the final days of the Obama administration, final year with Merrick Garland, there's been more discussion of court reform. And, you know, the position I've taken is that we should care much less about who's on the Supreme Court and how they get there. What we should care about is how much power the Supreme Court has. And if we engaged in some kind of edgy reforms, we could make the Supreme Court much less important in our national life by reallocating power back to the legislature. So you can see actually on both sides of our discussion, my position is to force the legislature to do the democratic work it's supposed to do in war and in policy making when it's been allowed to shunt so much power to the judiciary. So examples of this reform are jurisdiction stripping and a supermajority rule. So let me just explain those. A jurisdiction stripping a device says, okay, Congress is going to pass a new law, like, you know, a COVID law or a single payer healthcare law or a Green New Deal law. It also can say that this law should be immune from invalidation in the Supreme Court. And why not try it? That wasn't tried with the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and look what happened to it. No one believed that the Supreme Court would ever mess with it. Yet, the Supreme Court, shot some major holes in it and has left it beset by litigation for a decade and a half. The other idea of supermajority rule would work like this. What if we required the Supreme Court justices to agree 7 or 8 or 9 votes in favor to invalidate Congress's legislation? Right now, you can have 5 conservatives rewrite a law or just overturn it altogether. And if we had a higher total required, we can presume that it would be harder for, any self-interested group to change the law from the way the legislature intended it. Or at least they would have to make more deals across party lines. And so that's a really, it's actually a proposal that someone in the comments, whom again, was it Hugh? I forget. Hugh mentioned Robert La Follette, back in the early 20th century. So all of these proposals that began to be discussed in the last couple of years are actually old. They were invented by progressives and socialists. The trouble is that liberals and progressives began to idolize the Supreme Court and think of it as an agent of justice in the 1950s and 60s. And sadly, it maybe wasn't much of one even then, and certainly hasn't been for several decades. And so I think we need to begin to think about disempowering the Supreme Court so we don't convert our elections into like referenda on who gets to appoint the justices. That's what's happened in the past 25 years, especially when you get voters who choose their presidential candidate based on what they want to happen to the Supreme Court. The recipe is disempowering the court so we don't have to care as much about who's on it and how long they stay and when they die.
Yeah, right. No, I'm glad you're out there making these arguments about disempowering the Supreme Court. I've heard a lot of people talk about packing the Supreme Court, and I think the issues you talk about are a little bit deeper and more systemic and very important to address. So, thanks for talking about this stuff. And something you said reminded me of a question I had. So we'll ask my question. Then I'm going to kick it off to Brian for a question, and then Jack. But you spoke about your view essentially is both with the Supreme Court and issues of war and peace about how the legislative branch should basically be taking more power to exercise the democratic will of the people. And, you guys write here in the Infinity War about, here, let me quote a line. You're talking about domestic law, and it says some stuff, but then it goes on to say, quote, after defaulting on its constitutional obligation during the Cold War, partly on the grounds that the speed of a potential nuclear strike required a president who could respond quickly, Congress declined to reclaim its authority after the Soviet threat passed. So the question is, after the Soviet Union fell and ostensibly they let go of some of their authority to the president because of the speed of a nuclear strike, but after the Soviet Union passed, why didn't they retake their authority?
Well, I think that's a great question because, some of you will remember that it was thought that the end of the Cold War would allow a peace dividend and so forth. And it is shocking to many people, the statistic we report in the Infinity War piece that of the interventions that the Congressional Research Service has counted since 1945, the vast majority are since 1989, not before it. I think there are a few reasons. restraint ruled in the Republican Party under George W. Bush's father, George Herbert Walker Bush, the president at the end of the Cold War. And yet even he, kind of got trigger happy. I doubt, we could have avoided Gulf War One, which, it had some kind of UN sign off, but then we really get into the Clinton years. And I think it's this liberal internationalist ideology, which it was supplemented at that time by this new humanitarianism. And, the best example of that was the Kosovo bombings. I've just mentioned that I was involved as a White House intern at the time. And I remember vividly, as some of you may, back in 1999, that, the idea of force for a good cause was really omnipresent. And it went so far that NATO didn't feel it needed United Nations authorization, which it didn't get because of Russian opposition. And yet NATO went anyway. And to me, that set up the precedent for Iraq and so many other interventions later. And so I think we knew as Americans in 1945 that war is the worst thing that can happen. That's why we made it, the marquee crime at Nuremberg. And that's why we set up the United Nations to stand for peace, not even justice, peace. But, after decolonization, most wars did not involve us, did not involve exposure of our, husbands, sons, brothers, and now women in the military. And instead it looked as if we could set ourselves up as saviors of, mostly brown people killing one another in third world countries. And, the sad thing is not that there isn't violence that is horrible around the world, but that America has only made it worse. And again, the Libyan intervention in the name of saving strangers is the most graphic evidence. So I think there was a little bit of the rule of interest, the rule of these ideologies of American primacy, and even, the moral belief that our power, required us to fight wars for good causes. And I think we now can see that for every war you fight under some, excuse, someone else is going to abuse that as a pretext. If not the next president, some foreign leader. And so that's why the goal of constraining force and doing no harm should always take pride of place, absent the most exigent circumstances. I don't think we're in good position yet to explain how America at the end of the Cold War became, the most warlike country. Just judged by scale and scope and duration of war, maybe of any country in history.
Yeah, sure. Brian, I think you had a question.
Sure. Thanks, Amar, and thanks, Professor Moyn. I think history has borne out what you're saying, even going much farther back in terms of our early intervention into Cuba at the end of the 19th century, and in the Philippines. There once was a strong anti-interventionist creed in this country, and I think throughout the 20th century, we've seen that slowly change. It's almost like intervention creep. My question was actually about anti-interventionism in American jurisprudence, because Hugh was talking about, how divisive this country has become. But it struck me that an area of common ground is this belief in the Constitution across the political spectrum. People hold that document in high regard, and it's actually a very anti-interventionist document. I think it was Madison who said that the most important part of the Constitution was the part that gave war-making ability to the legislature instead of the president. So given how much support there is for the Constitution and how important that particular part of the Constitution is, why the lack of anti-interventionism in American jurisprudence today?
I think it's a great question. I do think it's changing, in part because we're seeing new voices on the left and the right. Not necessarily because they believe in the Constitution in the way that, the average American does, but because they understand the power of the Constitution for Americans. And it can be so easily shown, as you say, that the founders had a very different view about the allocation of war powers than we have really since the Cold War. The biggest breaking point in that story is in the later 30s, when in like a last gasp of anti-interventionism, there was an attempt to forestall the Second World War. But the Cold War made it really not possible to go back and, even, folks like Robert Taft voted for the United Nations Charter. And since then, the idea of returning to the Constitution has not been popular still. Just recently, some conservative originalist scholars have begun to think that they made a gross error. After all, you all remember John Yoo, the Yale law-trained Berkeley professor who wrote the torture memos. He actually made his name as an originalist scholar, claiming that the founders intended the executive to be all-powerful. But that's, of course, ridiculous as a historical matter. And amazingly, these days, most conservative originalists will say it's ridiculous because they understand that something has gone wrong in American life, and they're repudiating John Yoo's understanding of the Constitution. On the left, I think, the Trump era has scared a lot of folks who were very complacent for a very long time. And they understand that the hyper-militarism of America should give way to an understanding of national security that's about health and welfare. I mean, when you have a government that can't cope with a pandemic, why are you spending all of your money on, drones and airplanes? It's not like anyone on the left ever forgot that the Constitution said one thing and Americans started doing another, but they just didn't think it was as big a deal. And now I think we're seeing signs of possible change. And this goes back to the beginning of the discussion, because as Amar said, we don't know what the key people whom Biden's putting in power think. We know they say that they need to reinvent American national security, but do they mean it? Do they plan to come back to constitutional arrangements? Well, my own reading of the tea leaves is that they will continue the war on terror because they, as of now, rightly think that Americans are not very upset about the drone and special forces war, or think it's just. But if there are new interventions that kind of loom, that's when the test will come. Remember, Libya came out of nowhere for Barack Obama, Syria too. So, we have to see what choices does Biden face in the press of events in the next 4 years, and what do he and his staff do? Do they ask Congress to sign off on any interventions? Well, we'll see. I think it's more possible than before because there's a more widespread awareness of how dreadfully wrong our imperial presidency has gone in so many areas, built by Republicans and Democrats like playing tag team long before Trump got the job.
Yeah, that's right. I do have a question before we get to Jack. And it might be kind of outside the scope of the topics tonight, but I'm still interested in your thoughts. You mentioned John Yoo, who was, I think he kind of wrote the legal justifications for torture, basically, that the Bush administration used. And John Yoo, if I remember correctly, isn't he teaching at Stanford or something now? So
At Berkeley.
At Berkeley, okay, sure. So my question is, these people, like someone like John Yoo, who authored the torture memos, and people who engage in essentially war crimes, why are they still accepted in polite society? Not only are they accepted in John Yoo's case, they're elevated to positions of prominence. I mean, we talk about morality. What could be more immoral than torture and war and murder?
Yeah, that case is pretty distinctive because John Yoo was a tenured professor before. And, we think that unless you're convicted of a crime, you don't get removed from a tenured job because we don't want blacklisting to happen to the left, which did happen. So, I would defend his right to be there absent some process, which sadly Obama said wasn't going to happen. And I think, a bigger question involves folks like, Michael Morell, who's being proposed to be the Central Intelligence Agency director, who was deeply involved in torture and supported it back in the day. And this is Joe Biden, who, absent pressure, is planning to appoint someone of that ilk to high power. And, not just Joe Biden, but Antony Blinken, supported Iraq. My view is that declaring an illegal war is much worse than torturing a few people. The one causes millions of deaths and the other causes unconscionable pain to some number, but many fewer, and they're still alive. And so I think we should go back to the 1945 and remember that war is the crime, not war crimes that matter. So by that standard, I don't see how any of these folks who, voted for and supported the Iraq war should have any further, political power. Sadly, the resistance gave it back to them just because they opposed Trump. So many neocons like Bill Kristol and all the rest. And to me, that's outrageous. Not only torture, or even more than torture. And then there's the issue of, business as usual, non-criminal, networks called the blob, where it's just assumed that there's like pay to play, we'll continue the military industrial complex and find new uses for it. We're not getting paid directly, but, in 4 years, we will, once we're out of power and get back on the Raytheon board. That's all legal, but that ought to be outrageous because that's what's driving the whole thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's a great point you made about tenure as well, and how we shouldn't revoke it from people that'll hurt the left. I'm glad we got a chance to talk about that. All right, so next I will kick it off to our intern, Jack. Jack is a high school senior and a prospective student at Yale University, actually. He has aspirations of international humanitarian law, and he's working on some events for December 10th for Human Rights Day. So, Jack, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Mar. Appreciate it. And definitely want to extend my gratitude to you, Professor Moyn, for giving us your time this evening and your ear. So thank you so much for all of the advice and perspectives you've given us. But I do, as Amar alluded to right there, of my interest in international humanitarian law and what I'm planning for December 10th for Human Rights Day. I want to twist this, put it on its head a little bit, and ask you, give you a little inquiry about how this relates to human rights, because just relating to what you were speaking about just prior to this, about the legal justification for torture created during the Bush administration back then, how that really human rights is the crux of all of this that we're talking about when it's related to war and peace, of course. So just reflecting on what you've already said, I want to condense what I had planned to say into one sort of statement, which is this. What I wrote, what do you think we need to change in politics, law, and the courts in the near future in order to stop this endless war and also advocate for human rights protection? Of course, human rights are the crux of all of this. And you said that since the UN was created sort of with this American priority almost, it sort of makes the International Declaration of Human Rights almost a gimmick, in that it is what the United States was prioritizing. So I want to ask you, is the UN the right root of all of this? Is our courts the right root of this? And how can young people be involved in this new, invigorated, foundational human rights movement that has really sort of started up since the 70s? And how can we advocate for humanitarian legislation? Basically, what is the best route that we need to go down after everything and all the perspectives you've just given us?
Well, you probably asked the wrong person, since, my main, claim to scholarly fame or notoriety is like wondering if human rights are the answer. In the terms that we've been talking about today, we shouldn't fail to note that, human rights were, kind of part of the smokescreen in the creation of an American-led United Nations that, among other things, left us with very few tools to constrain American war. And then, as you note, you get human rights activism, principally since the 1970s, but that means that human rights activism surges on the grave of anti-war activism, as well as socialist politics, both of which I favor. Now, that doesn't mean we can't say that we're for human rights. Of course, if we're for human rights, we're for things like the right to peace, which was talked about in the United Nations in the 1980s briefly, or we're for economic and social rights, which are in the Universal Declaration, which the United States has never really accepted. I mean, rhetorically a bit in the 40s. Actually, Donald Trump's, Mike Pompeo's Commission on Unalienable Rights did give more favorable treatment to economic and social rights than any presidential administration. And we care about things like distributional equality, in our age of the victory of the rich, that isn't really a human rights concern. It's a concern about social justice that human rights don't capture, since they're about the basic decencies in life, not how rich the rich can get. So, my take is we need a broad politics that's more ambitious than human rights movements have been, both because they prioritize peace, because war is the main affront to human rights historically. Sadly, human rights has been in our time sometimes an apologia for American war, defending human rights abroad. And not that that's necessarily something we shouldn't care about, but that the results have been disastrous in so many places. So, you know, a broader cause that made sure that human rights were part of the solution, but that, you know, critically revived some of these earlier anti-war and socialist tendencies and reframed human rights in light of them, seems like the more promising step now. Just one last thing, you know, you said that young people are for human rights. I don't see that. I think they were the only game in town when I was young in the 1990s. But now you have, you know, abolitionism, defund, Black Lives Matter, you know, Jacobin. None of these causes are about human rights, or at least say they are. We can say they are if we want to describe them differently. And so to me, it seems like your generation has this fortunate, like, you know, cornucopia of causes alongside human rights. And that's a good thing.
Thanks, Professor. Jack, if you end up going to Yale, maybe you could take some of Professor Moyn's classes.
Or don't. I mean, you might want to avoid them.
Or you might want to avoid
I doubt it. I
one.
highly doubt it.
Okay, sure. So, Professor Moyn, let's get ready to close this off for the night. Do you have any closing remarks? I have some. So, do you have anything you want to?
No, I've talked your ear off, and I've really appreciated everyone's patience, and the commentary and the chat has been really interesting and worthwhile. So, thanks to you all.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Unfortunately, I didn't read too much into the chat because I get distracted easily, but I'll look at the transcripts later. So no, thank you for joining us. You didn't talk our ear off at all. I think I was very engaged, and I think we got to talk about a lot of great things. All right, so to close us off for the night, I will read the last paragraph of the Infinity War. It says, the United States would find partners far and wide in nations great and small if it put peace first. It could make clear that while spreading democracy or human rights remains worthwhile, values cannot come at the point of a gun or serve as a pretext for war, and that international peace is, in fact, a condition for human flourishing. Every time Washington searches for a monster to destroy, it shows the world's despots how to abuse the rules and hands demagogues a phantom to inflate. The alternative is not isolationism, but closer to the opposite: peaceful, lawful international cooperation against the major threats to humanity, including climate change, pandemic disease, and widespread deprivation. Those are the enemies worth fighting, and bombs and bullets will not defeat them. So on that note, thank you, Professor Moyn, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts, your expertise and experience with us. Thank you to everyone for sharing your time with us tonight. Mass Peace Action, let me just remind everyone, is an organization driven by volunteers. If anybody is interested in volunteering with Mass Peace Action, we have working groups focused on the Middle East, on climate change, on Latin America, whatever you're into, we have a working group about it related to foreign policy. So you could email me. I'll be sending a follow-up email with the video with this video in the next day or two, or you could email info@masspeaceaction.org. And on that note, I want to say to everyone, have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.